Hi there. Good evening and welcome to our Beach Sand Replenishment and Retention Device Project workshop number 2 for the City of Oceanside. We're going to give just a few moments while attendees come in. And just a reminder, you've joined us in listen only mode. So I do see several attendees coming in. We'll get started in just a moment. Okay, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for the feasibility study for the Oceanside Beach Sand Replenishment and Retention Device Project, public workshop number 2. And thank you for your interest in this project. I am Stacy Mueller from GHD, and I'll be hosting tonight's event. Amanda Bomar and Simona Ramirez Diaz, also from GHD, will assist in the production and moderation of today's event. You may not see them or hear them, but we appreciate their hard work in the background. We're all likely adapting to new technology, so to cover some items to expect while listening or viewing our event today, we're hopeful you'll be patient with us as we work diligently to bring our event to you tonight. And tonight's event is being recorded and will be made available for future viewing through links on the city's webpage. And secondly, you've joined us in the Zoom webinar platform, and there will be a period during today's event when those of you who have joined us by the internet will be able to ask questions and share your comments through a Q&A feature and a raised hand feature on your screen. We will share instructions on how to submit those questions just before our question and answer session begins. And please note that questions and comments that you submit today may be published for all attendees to view during today's event and may be made available in the future public reports. So I would like to get started with tonight's agenda. We'll be asking all of our attendees to take a few poll questions this evening before we get started. And then next you'll hear from Kyle Koger, the Public Works Director for the City of Oceanside, and from Brian Leslie and Aaron Holloway with GHD, and also from Laura Ingeman with the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, or SIO. And then we'll open up a Q&A session and polling opportunity, hopefully near the end of the hour. And we'll hear from Kyle once again to summarize what's next in the process for solutions related to potential needs for sand retention and beach nourishment. So we encourage you to keep these commitments as participants in mind today, whether you've joined us as an attendee, a presenter, or a panelist. Keep this meeting purpose in mind, recognize there will be a diversity of perspectives that you'll hear tonight, and recommend that this isn't the last opportunity to have dialogue about this project. So before you hear from our presenters today, we're going to invite you to participate in our first couple of poll questions. I think we have 3 to help us understand who is attending this evening. So the first question that will appear on your device or on your screen in just a moment, we're going to ask you how you most frequently enjoy the city of Oceanside beach areas. Is it A, an active recreation activity such as swimming, surfing, walking, or running? B, maybe it's a passive recreation activity such as spending days at the beach, fishing, or at the playground. C, maybe you most enjoy the coastal views and the overlooks, such as the piers, stairways, or sidewalk infrastructure. Or D, perhaps others. So Simona, if you'll launch our poll, we'll give everybody a few moments to respond. Okay, I see that we have some good response rate here with our poll. So Simona's going to share those results on the screen with you. And it looks like many of you are enjoying active recreation activities this evening, with a few of you weighing in on passive coastal views and overlooks. We'll move on to question number 2 on our polling. And question number 2 asks how you identify. So we'd like to know this evening if you identify as a coastal resident of the city of Oceanside. And this may mean that you live within 2 blocks from the beach for the purposes of this evening's event. Are you B, a resident of the city of Oceanside, so maybe not coastal or within 2 blocks from the beach? C, a non-resident of the city of Oceanside, but you value what the beach has to offer? Or D, none of these options apply to me? So Simona will have you launch poll question number 2, and we'll give everyone a few moments to respond. Okay, I see most of our attendees have responded, and Simona will share those results. So I do understand that maybe we haven't selected all of the options this evening, or anticipated all of the options that may apply to you, but it looks like most of you are identifying that you live within 2 blocks from the beach or a coastal resident, with many of you also responding that you're a resident of the city of Oceanside. So a couple of questions have come in on how many people are being polled, and I think we have seen 151 attendees in tonight, and I think about 80% of those attendees are responding to poll questions. So those are certainly percentages of those responding. So hopefully that answers one of the questions coming in. We'll move on to question 3. And for question 3, we're asking, how has beach loss impacted your beach experience? So do you consider yourself a highly impacted by beach loss, B, somewhat impacted, B, somewhat impacted, or C, not impacted at all? So highly, somewhat, or not impacted. And Simona will launch question number 3. We'll give everybody a few moments again to respond. And I'm seeing the responses slow down. I think everybody's got a hang of our polling. Many of you, 87% of you responding, and I think about 86% of you on the call, switching to 88 now, it's ticking up, are highly impacted by beach loss with your beach experience. So those are the first 3 questions we have for you. We'll go ahead and move on. As you listen to our presenters this evening, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A feature on your screen. We'll raise these questions to the presenters during the Q&A session, and we'll acknowledge receipt of questions with a general response and publish the questions so that other attendees may view them during this event. For those attendees that may have just dialed in, or you've switched to a dial-in option only during the event, you will also have the opportunity to ask questions during the Q&A session, and we'll let you know how you can do that as we begin. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Kyle Koger of the City of Oceanside. Kyle, are you ready to begin?
I am. Thank you, Stacy. Welcome, everyone, to the second public workshop for the beach sand feasibility study. GHD has been working on this project for a little bit over a year, and we're excited to share the results and get your feedback tonight. Oceanside has a long history of beach erosion, starting with the construction of Camp Pendleton in 1942. The city initiated the study to identify feasible solutions to protect the beach from long-term erosion by either utilizing renourishment projects of beach-suitable sands or construction of retention devices or to retain or reduce the loss of sand, or a combination of both. The goal of the study was to identify strategies that are environmentally sensitive, financially feasible, and that have a reasonable chance of being approved. Next slide, please.
Brian, you're on mute.
Oh, I've got this part. Thanks, Brian.
Yep.
City staff, along with GHD, held several virtual meetings with the community, stakeholders, resource agencies, and interested parties. Some of these to include the California Coastal Commission, Regional Water Quality Control Board, Corps of Engineers, Surfrider Foundation, Sandag Shoreline Preservation Working Group, the San Diego Climate Collaborative Sea Level Rise Working Group, Resilient Cities Catalyst, and the 2 public workshops, the second one we're having tonight. GHD initiated the study with the review and analysis of relevant global projects and developed 6 concepts as a starting point. These concepts were then run through a multi-criteria decision matrix and ranked. The decision matrix considered downdrift impacts, surfing impacts, nearshore reef impacts, aesthetics impacts, sea level rise resilience, estimated construction costs, and life cycle costs. Concepts were narrowed down to 1 option from each category in retention and replenishment, which GHD will run through next. The final report of the study will be released along with the staff report prior to the August 11th, 2021 City Council workshop, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Thanks again for your participation today. And now I'll turn it over to Brian Leslie, who's the project manager with GHD.
Great. Thanks, Kyle, and good evening, everybody. Good to be talking to you all again. Thanks for that intro, Kyle. I want to give you a quick snapshot of what we're going to be talking about this evening. It's basically these 6 bulleted items. It's going to be summarize the coastal challenges and the coastal problems in the city of Oceanside and the way we see them. Give you a snapshot of what we've done as far as collecting scientific baseline and getting the citizen science program off the ground. Going to go through the nourishment and retention options and the evaluation of them, and also the standard distribution options and how what evaluation of those and which ones we've found to be preferred. And then summarize our findings and go to next steps. So to first start with the coastal challenges, we've basically put the coastal challenges into 4 major buckets, and we'll go through those in the next few slides. The first challenge really has to do with this Oceanside Harbor complex. The harbor's impact on downdrift shorelines has really been well documented over numerous studies and over time. So harbor construction in the 40s was said to create this erosional wave that moved down the coastline all the way to La Jolla. This plot shows just Camp Pendleton to about Agua Hedionda and kind of the impact the harbor had on those shorelines. And what you can see is the erosional area that, so this is a 1934 shoreline as compared to 06. So shoreline about 60 years later. 1934 is pre-construction of the harbor, 2006 being 60 years after. So you can see this wide swath of erosion and kind of a localized area of accretion just updrift of the harbor. So related to this challenge of the harbor complex and its impoundment of sediment has to do with sediment gradation. So sediment gradation is really important to a beach and having that recreational dry beach in particular. So coarse gradation sand is what you find on these dry beaches. It's heavier, bigger diameter particles that are not as easily moved by waves. Fine sand exists below the mean lower low water, so in the surf zone and near shore, where the wave and current velocities are less, so the sediment drops out. So what we see in Oceanside is a coarse grained sediment is not making its way down past the harbor. It's not making its way to city beaches. The fine grained sediment dredged by the Corps each year is adding to the beaches, but it's really only adding to the submerged profile, or this surf zone near shore kind of profile. So more on challenges around the Corps' maintenance dredging program in challenge number 2. So there's a number of things going on with this harbor dredging program that creates challenges. We found that the sand from this program does little to really benefit the city beaches. Several reasons for this. First has to do with sediment type, which we just hinted on. A lot of fine-grained sediment coming out of these navigational channels. Within beach building, size of the particle matters. As we kind of alluded to, the coarser sediment stays on the dry beach. Finer grained sediment moves offshore and into the surf zone and near shore. So this plot demonstrates what different fill grade sizes versus the native beach grain sizes, how they react. So you build your beach, which is the dotted black line. In option 1, this is the fill grain size, which is coarser than the native grain size. That sand equilibrates, which is shown with this blue profile, and where it equilibrates and stays on the dry beach. So this is the coarser option. Profile 2 is your grain size from your beach and your fill match, and your equilibrium profile kind of blends across the whole profile. Profile 3 is what we're dealing with in Oceanside, where we have this fill grain that's much finer than the beach, or that material lands within the submerged profile. Related to this, but definitely secondary, is a placement method. Every year, the Corps places the material in the surf zone via this pipeline slurry mix. Pipeline slurry mix is about 80% water, 20% sand. The slurry is allowed to flow freely into the surf zone and then is scraped up by dozers immediately downdrift. So typical beach nourishment projects that are interested in beach building have training dikes that act to slow the water velocity and have the sand drop out on the beach, and then kind of move the sand, manipulate the sand into a profile. So the Corps doesn't do this for a number of reasons, but it's a contributing factor to why these gains don't happen from the harbor program. The other big challenge, or reason why we're not seeing a lot of gains from the harbor dredging, has to do with the timing and the timing and placement locations. So sand is placed typically within the spring. So it's they dredge in the spring and place within these variety of locations. They struggle to make it too much south of the pier, but this is coincident with the kind of change in the wave climate. Climate changes from a north dominant swell direction to a south dominant swell direction. So these waves are pushing sediment to the north during this period of time. So what you're seeing is kind of like the circular flow of sand within this northern segment of the city, and you're not really seeing the benefits to the south. The third challenge we came across was a poor performance of the regional beach fill program. So regional beach sand project conducted by, or carried out by Sandag in both 2001 and 2012, brought really great sand to a lot of beaches within the county. And Oceanside was no exception. In 2001, the city got 400,000 cubic yards of sand. And in RBSP2 in 2012, the city received 300,000 cubic yards of sand. Really coarse, good sediment. So the good for building towel space. So this is just kind of an intro to that project. And then we'll kind of get into how these fills performed over time. So what we saw is the problem with these beach fills, they didn't perform too well within Oceanside. They didn't kind of stay within that zone where the sand was placed. This shows a shoreline response from about the harbor to Agua Hedionda. And what you can see is that within 3 years, essentially this Oceanside fill was lost. So lost here, but there's gains on either side. So there's some gains in the harbor area, Harbor Beach, and by the San Luis Rey Groin, but also significant gains within the North Carlsbad area. Those gains are still actually being realized in Carlsbad. It seems like the beaches are still benefiting from that fill 10 years later. Kind of a closer look at that area and why we think that's happening. What you have at Carlsbad is these jetties at the Agua Hedionda Lagoon, which effectively act like groins in interrupting sand transport. So the coarse grained fill would basically move down the coast and was retained by these jetties. Beaches in North Carlsbad, like I said, are still benefiting from this project. 10 years later, we're seeing this accretion of about 3.5 feet per year since 1990. I know this is generalized across that time, but again, these beaches are doing really well. And kind of a nod to how retention can act within this system. The fourth challenge is really kind of a softer challenge in that the city is, like other coastal cities, have difficulty in reaching social, political, and regulatory consensus around management decisions. And so this is not the first study to look at and recommend sand retention as an option for Oceanside. It's actually like the fifth or so. So challenges and competing interests amongst the community, stakeholders, and resource agencies have precluded sand retention from moving forward. The experimental sand bypass program, which we've talked about in past meetings, was a result actually of a sand retention option, this preferred growing option that was put forward by the Corps in the 80s, kind of being shot down by the community and political and regulatory constraints. So the experimental sand bypass project was a compromise, and this 9 growing option was preferred. And this system, as everybody probably knows, was a failure after a few years, was deemed a failure, I should say. And that was a result also of entities not working well together. So this project was not able to impact the Marine Corps property or touch their property or impact their operations, which really kind of tied the hands of the project team of where they could source the sand. So this led to the project sourcing sand in the surf zone off of the North Breakwater. And this was an area that didn't refill with or recharge with sand very quickly. So one of the major constraints of this project and why it failed. And we totally get the difficulty in making these decisions within these coastal communities. There's trade-offs with each of these options. There's big costs sometimes, and there's difficulty to predict some of these impacts that we're talking about with accuracy. But given the state of sea level rise, the state of beaches today in Oceanside and sea level rise projections moving forward, it really seems like we need to work together to build resilience in these communities and start making these tough decisions. Continue to do what we've always done is not going to sustain our beaches. Okay, so on our project and our project approach, and kind of recognizing these project challenges, we've designed it to start small and build with success. So we got this pilot project approach. We want to be adaptable and reversible. So kind of designing with that in mind so that we can offset impacts. The project would be informed by a robust scientific monitoring program that we've already kind of started to spin up that Laura will talk to you in a second. So we've got a baseline established and the citizen science program that Laura will speak to. And off to you, Laura.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. So from the Scripps perspective, we've been looking at what kind of information we can sort of bring to light in terms of what the baseline conditions are at the Oceanside beaches. We have, as an institution, we have expanded our capabilities of doing shoreline surveys all the way through North County more recently. And so we now do quarterly or biannual surveys through Oceanside using our LiDAR, laser detection system that essentially provides high resolution surveys of the beach area. And then to supplement for this project, in addition to that, we did bring a crew up in January of 2021 to go ahead and get the surf zone and the nearshore area in addition to the LiDAR so that we could really get the full beach profile in terms of a baseline condition. So that was provided to the project team. And we will continue to do the biannual fall, spring and fall LiDAR surveys through Oceanside to continue to track change there. I think next slide. So in addition to that, as I mentioned, those surveys are only done twice a year. So, oh, and we have the slide. So we're looking at essentially this is what we call the jumbo survey, which is essentially the complete beach profile going all the way from the back shore of the beach all the way offshore. And again, this is to try and help with understanding, what kind of sand volume and sandbars are really building offshore. And so as you'll see in the monitoring report slide, doing this kind of survey would be really important to any sort of sand retention or nourishment project to understand where the sand is going alongshore and offshore. So then in addition, to try and capture a little bit more consistent data on change and fluctuation in the beach in Oceanside, we did work with the community group SOS to provide them with some handheld GPS and approaches and transects so that they could do monthly surveys, which they can then add to our biannual or quarterly surveys that we can get in Oceanside. So we've been compiling this data, just sort of tracking the both seasonal and then now the annual change in the Oceanside beach conditions. So there you see the cross-shore profile that we have so far from, I think that's early 2020 to today. Essentially the last one was in April. And then the last piece that we're working on is really outlining what the main components of a monitoring plan would look like. So without any specific project in place, this is really looking at any sort of a typical sand retention or nourishment projects, but really thinking about, the change in beach width and volume compared to those baseline conditions. So sort of tracking the beach building and the beach resilience, and then downdrift impacts, so where that sand is going. And then in particular, really looking also at response to storm events. So seasonal and annual monitoring is really key to understanding those seasonal changes and potentially the bounce back of the beach from year to year. But then response to storm events is also a critical component of understanding whether or not, sand is actually being retained on the during these storm events or whether there's significant beach loss still occurring. And then the recreational impacts would be looking at somewhat of what happens in the near shore in terms of sandbar buildup or impacts to the active and passive recreation activities. And so there's a combination of tools that we can use for this. As I mentioned before, just using sort of your standard GPS survey technology to both get the volume of sand or the elevation of the sand along the beach as well as the beach width. Using the high resolution tools for capturing the more high resolution sort of beach profile all the way out into the surf zone. Video cameras may be possible for helping to capture both just long-term video monitoring of the beach, but also potentially those post-storm monitoring and field conditions, as well as what could be helpful to have community surveys to monitor after those storm events in particular, or maybe just monthly as we've been doing so far. And then field inspection and documentation, again, really would be a bit more critical around that post-storm event or post-high wave event to really see how the interaction of the beach is happening and what sort of losses and sand movement you might have seen. So with that, I'll pass it back to GHD.
Perfect. Thanks, Laura. So now we'll get into the project alternatives. And we have 4 action alternatives: beach nourishment, groin, the South Jetty or San Luis Rey groin extension, and a reef pilot. I wanted to mention that the sand distribution options are still coming, But we recognize within each of these action alternatives, we need a lot of good sand. So those kind of are almost standalone and kind of, they go with any of these options. So they're talked about next or after we evaluate these action alternatives. Each of these action alternatives are evaluated against or compared against the No project, which is the status quo, and of the harbor program doing what the harbor program does, and the city continued to participate in regional programs on like a 10-year basis. Again, we compare these action alternatives against the no action for comparative purposes and context. We want to present what we consider our pilot reach. We want to acknowledge that more refinement is needed to kind of pin this down, but this is the segment that we think makes the most sense at this time. Selection considerations for this reach were, and first what it is, it's, as I guess everybody probably knows, it's basically sea gaze down to Wisconsin. And the reason why we're recommending this area is that because it's erosion impacted, it's very popular. It's one of these kind of like heart of the city kind of locations where a lot of recreation happens. And there's also city ownership of landside right of way, which is kind of a big plus for this reach as well, with the ownership of the strand and the utilities within it. So alternative one is beach nourishment. It is essentially the Regional Beach Sand Project 2 that is conducted on a more frequent basis. So it's 300,000 cubic yards placed every 5 years within this exact footprint that was used in RBSP 2. The gradation of the sand would probably be similar to all the same parameters. The life cycle costs for each of these alternatives is presented, and that's basically the cost of an option over a 20-year period. So the life cycle cost of this option is about 28 million. This assumes sand from offshore at this point. Considerations with this option is that basically what we saw from RBSP 1 and 2, we can't really bank on having a great dry beach from this program, and that based on the performance of those fills, and kind of where that sand goes is a question mark within the city. So we might not have it where we want it most, say. A benefit is that downdrift impacts are not really a thing. There's actually what we're seeing here with RBSP 2 is a downdrift, benefit, big gains within Carlsbad. Second option is a pilot groin field. We're recommending 4 600-foot long groins along the pilot reach. This option would include a beach nourishment pre-fill, so an initial fill of 300,000 cubic yards. But then because of the benefits of the retention of sand within the structures, we could reduce the fill at that 5-year interval to 150,000 cubic yards. And this is based on our findings from the numerical modeling. The life cycle cost for this option is 51 million. That includes a decommissioning or taking out of the structures at the end, or significant adaptation, I believe, or removal. As far as considerations, these are all the ones we've talked about before, the downdrift impacts, potential surfing impact potential. These are all things we'd be looking at and fine tuning within the monitoring plan and the design to try to mitigate these impacts. Other things to think through with the design would be the lateral access piece and making sure that people can move across the structures. People and also emergency vehicles can kind of move laterally on the beach and to the beach. Rip currents are likely with groins or any type of coastal structures. So that's something that people are pretty used to and ways to manage that, but that's something to consider. The third option is to extend the south jetty or groin 350 feet offshore in combination with nourishment similar to RBSP 2. So 300,000 cubic yards is placed initially and then is also placed at the 5-year recurrence interval. So the idea behind this option is that we're placing the sand here, but we're hoping to catch it before it gets into the harbor, so that this option would be coupled with a bypassing option or backpassing option where trucks would capture the sand at the San Luis Rey groin and bring it back down the beach, or maybe there's a mechanical system that that's deployed, like the sand distribution options that we'll talk about in a second. This option is $36 million over the 20 years. And then key performance considerations with this option are the performance. Similar to the nourishment option, we can't really accurately predict where this fill is going to go. And we're going to have to continue to kind of manipulate it to kind of put it back where we want it, potentially. And the potential for surfing impacts from the extension of that groin or South Jetty is unknown, but that's a known surfing resource. We're a popular resource within the city, so it's something that's sensitive. The fourth option is multi-purpose artificial reefs. We're proposing 2 emergent rubble mound breakwaters with submerged surfable edges, each structure being about 1,000 feet long. Beach nourishment is proposed as similar to the groins, 300,000 cubic yards initially, and then 150,000 cubic yards at that 5-year recurrence interval, or shouldn't call it recurrence interval, that 5-year frequency, due to the retention properties of the reefs. This is the most expensive option. It's about $148 million over the 20 years. Some key considerations are that this design is unproven. The breakwaters we have high confidence in how those would perform. But as far as surfing improvements or the surfable edges, that's an unproven design in Southern California. And so we can't guarantee that surfing would be improved or negatively impacted. So other things to think about are downdrift impacts, and similar to groins, nearshore currents are likely around these structures. So to talk about the numerical modeling and how these options performed, and also how they scored within the MCA or multi-criteria analysis, I'm going to hand it off to Aaron Holloway.
Thanks, Brian. Sure. Yeah, we use the littoral processes and coastline kinetics model. It's known by the acronym LITPAC. It was developed as part of the MIC suite of modeling applications by the Delft Hydraulic Institute. It's a one-line model intended to simulate shoreline evolution over the long term, and is specifically designed to compare these different types of coastal structures to one another. So it made sense as the first look at some of these alternatives. The model domain stretches from Oceanside Harbor down to Agua Hedionda at the south end. The first step was to look at, okay, well, we set up the model, and then we looked at the RBSP2 project for a validation run to see how the model simulated observed changes from the Oceanside fill and North Carlsbad fill. And the model, to be honest, didn't have perfect agreement with the measured results, but that's expected. This is a one-dimensional model that takes a very complicated system and simplifies it down to a calculation of sediment transport rates at different points along the shoreline, and then adjusts the shoreline accordingly. So it's developed for use all around the world, not specifically the West Coast. And we have somewhat unique wave climate here with long period waves that come from both north and south. And a place like Oceanside has a lot of bidirectional sediment transport movement. And so there's a lot of complications there to resolve in a numerical model, and even in a physical model, as was documented by the Corps of Engineers in their 1980 physical modeling study. It's a complicated stretch to model, but nonetheless, it does provide a useful tool to compare these options. So in the full scale model, we looked at kind of this applying sediment retention along this longer reach of shoreline, just to gauge what's the benefit provided by these structures. And the results indicated 175 to 185% of the sand volume is retained in that area when compared to nourishment only. And so it identifies significant benefits associated with those structures, and also the different planforms you'd expect from a growing structure where sediment builds up alongside these structures and fillets, and then a series of offshore reefs, you'd have the sand building up behind them and what we call salients. So we took that modeling reach and we focused it down to a shorter length of coastline called the pilot reach. So we're looking at about a 1 mile segment of shoreline. So you can go to the next slide. And then this one lays out the pilot groin. series. So we have 4 groins as shown on the earlier slide, and we run the simulation for this shorter shoreline segment. The results are shown in the top, illustrate the beach width changes, and they show significant beach gains, at each of these groins. And they also show downdrift impacts. And so these results aren't surprising. They show what you'd expect it to show for a groin system. And the model is not precise, so we don't expect these maximum beach widths of 300 to 400 feet, but we do expect them to retain sand. And as a result of that, there could be some downdrift, localized impacts that would need to be monitored and mitigated. And the project, in future phases would be really looking closely at that and how those impacts could be mitigated. We also looked at the series of reefs in the pilot scale. So we looked at 2 reefs in that same location. And the model, predicted again significant beach width gains, over the simulation. And so we have, in this case, 2 emergent reefs were modeled as, offshore breakwaters in this scenario and showed significant accretion behind and updrift of these structures. And so it's an important thing about, when we're talking about beach width, how much do we need and what's an ideal beach width? And a lot of the beach widths reported from the sand ag projects are relative to mean sea level. And mean sea level is underwater more than half the time, with the wave activity on top of your static water level. A 50-foot mean sea level beach width really means there's a low tide beach at best. And there's not enough dry beach area with this kind of 50-foot average. And that's what was observed, over 5 years after that RBSP2 project. The average beach width gain along Oceanside was about 50 feet. And so that's about what you got. You got a low tide beach in front of the revetment for over that time period. Whereas early on, soon after the fill was placed in May, you have this 140-foot MSL beach width, which provides roughly 100 feet of dry beach. It is really the kind of the target, for a sand retention concept, is building a beach that's 100 to 150 feet in width to support this upper dry beach area for recreation, for storm protection, and also for sea level rise adaptability. And so when you consider the beach width gain for these different alternatives, you can compare that to the cost. And although groins are going to cost more because of the capital costs associated with those structures, the value provided, is illustrated in this plot. And the cost per acre of beach is much lower for the groins option than it is for beach nourishment alone. Not the same case for the reefs. The reefs require significantly higher volume of material, and so much more expensive. So the value doesn't show up for the reefs, but the groins certainly look like the better value compared to beach nourishment alone. And so the next step, once those alternatives were developed and modeled, was to evaluate them, against a list of criteria that were, custom developed to the project. They're intended to reflect the interest of the community, and that was reflected in the polling question 6 from the last workshop, where downdrift erosion, sea level rise resilience were some of the top concerns, followed by surfing impacts, costs, and public safety and access. And so we took that feedback, we developed 11 criteria and organized those into 3 categories of technical performance, financial, and environmental. And the next slide will show kind of how those different criteria were grouped. Under technical performance, we have the creation of dry beach, we have downdrift impacts, public safety, and sea level rise adaptability. So all of those criteria were each weighted equally at 25%. And altogether, those criteria make up about 40% of the total score available. Financial category was weighted at 20% of the total score. Within that category, we have life cycle costs, which include capital investment required to build these structures, or the initial in combination with the initial nourishment. O&M, or the follow-up renourishments over this pilot phase. And then we have, for the sand retention options, we have a budget placeholder for adaptation, or modifications to these structures at the end of this pilot phase based on what was what was learned from the monitoring efforts. Indirect economic benefits were another criteria in financial, just to sort of capture the benefits to the local economy from a wider beach and the increased tourism and activated waterfront that results from that resource. The environmental criteria was weighted highly at 40% of the total score. That includes biological resources, surfing resources, aesthetics, beach recreation, and coastal access, all weighted equally within that category. So these alternatives were all judged, against these different criteria. Total score available is 100%. And we'll go through kind of category by category what the results were. So in technical performance, we have no project scoring lowest, with the status quo providing least amount of beach, and also having impacts to downdrift communities because there's a lack of sediment supply, impacts to surfing resources because there is little or no beach, a lot of backwash off the existing revetment. The highest scoring alternatives were groins and reefs, with the added beach width lasting longer between each renourishment and improving the adaptability to sea level rise. Having a wider beach buffer is going to improve the ability of that system to absorb changes in sea level rise or storminess. Next category is financial. Beach nourishment and groins were the top scoring alternatives in financial. Beach nourishment had a lower life cycle cost, but like we talked about with the value, groins are going to provide a much greater beach width over a longer period of time. And so groins were scored higher in the indirect economic benefits category or criteria. So that was the main differentiator there. But both those alternatives scored pretty close. No project scores relatively high here just because there's much less cost on the city side to continue with harbor dredging and the occasional SANDAG project. And then the environmental category, the highest scoring alternatives here were multi-purpose reefs and groins. We recognize that those alternatives involve placing material on the seafloor, which has an impact. But over time, the reefs provide some habitat diversity in the rocky substrate. And they also provide a more stable beach, the groins and reefs. And so a more stable beach is more conducive to intertidal habitat versus the beach nourishment option or the groin modification option, where a lot of that sand comes and goes so rapidly that there's not a real stable, sustained intertidal habitat area throughout this project duration. So the biological, recreation, and access benefits were the key reasons why groins and reefs scored highest here. And so we put all that together, and groins is the highest scoring alternative. When considering those 11 criteria, scored 81% total, followed by multi-purpose reefs at 73%. And so we looked at this, taking feedback in from the different project team. We considered the sensitivity of the different scores provided to each category. The scores were provided on a scale of 1 to 5. If those change a little bit up or down, it would typically affect the overall score by a few percentage points, but not enough to change that outcome. We also looked at the category weighting, and if you weighted the categories differently of whether they're all equal. Like in this case, the top scenario has technical performance, financial, and environmental all weighted equally. We still have groins as the highest scoring alternative. And likewise, if you heavily weighted environmental, financial, or technical performance at 60% of the total score, then we still have the same result. So the sensitivity analysis indicates that groins is the highest scoring alternative, regardless of how you're going to weight these different categories or criteria. And I'll turn it back to you, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate that. So now we're going to get into the sand distribution options. As I mentioned, any of these action alternatives that Aaron just spoke to need sand and lots of it. So the three that we're going to talk about are the fixed trestle bypass, semi-fixed bypass, and a core piggyback option, which changed a little bit since the last time we've talked, but it's familiar, but we'll go through those in the next couple of slides. So the fixed trestle bypass is similar to that Tweed River example in Australia. It's a fixed trestle or a pier constructed on the Camp Pendleton side, just south of Santa Margarita. And the idea, through a multi-pump system, this pier would pump up sand from the active littoral zone and shoot it through a series of pipes, underground pipes, that would distribute it to a number of outlet locations on city beaches. So we show these junction boxes at different points that we think make sense at this stage. And the other thing with this distribution pipeline that we've contemplated was to do a horizontal directional drill under the San Luis Rey River mouth and under the North Coast Village to kind of remove that obstruction. That's a recognized obstruction during the core dredging program, and that they can't lay the pipe in front of the revetment because there's not enough beach typically. So that's why they place a lot of sand there before moving south. So this would kind of remove that obstruction. So this system would move the most amount of sand per year. We have it kind of an assumed volume of 100 to 300,000 cubic yards of sand per year. This would be, like the other systems, could be scaled up or down depending on how much of a need there is. This is an expensive system. It's $36 million initially to construct, approximately, and about $5 million per year in operation and maintenance costs. You know, this would take staff and quite a bit of again, operation to kind of keep it running well and keep the sand moving down through the system of pipelines. Some key considerations, I mentioned the cost. Construction of fixed infrastructure on Camp Pendleton seems to be a hurdle, a pretty significant hurdle to overcome. Sourcing sand from the base is a hurdle, but fixed infrastructure, I think, is a larger one. But another consideration is the risk of having this fixed system have a low recharge of sand. So you're going to basically pump sand and make these big depressions within the surf zone. And we need those depressions to fill back in for the system to work. So the prior system failed in that it wasn't able to, the sand didn't recharge quickly enough, amongst other things. So we want to be careful with that and make sure that we're conscious of that within our design. So the second system is really to address that concern and others, is to be the semi-fixed bypass system. So this would allow some mobility within certain areas to capture sand from different locations on the beach. And there's two different systems that we've talked about with this system, with this option. It's a sand shifter type of system, which is what Australia has a bunch of. They're underground pipelines and catchments that basically aren't, you don't see them, but until you turn them on, and then they make a big depression within the foreshore. So that system's an option. But another option that we've learned about and since got pretty excited about, frankly, is the Indian River bypass system, which uses a pump station, a series of distribution pipelines, but then a crane that manipulates the cutter head suction dredge around certain areas. So again, this gives us flexibility to capture sand from where it's in surplus and kind of the best place to grab it in a specific year. These systems all move less material, about 50 to 100,000 cubic yards per year. The costs are lower at about $11 million initially. These are rough costs, and about 200,000 cubic yards per year in O&M. So again, we could scale this based on needs within the city. We have the ability to move, which is a key benefit to the system. But again, with our eyes to the Camp Pendleton fillet as being the highest quality and sustainable source of sand to the city, we're going to require that Camp Pendleton cooperation. So the third option is to piggyback on the CORS program, the CORS Harbor Dredging Program. This is a common thing that people do across the nation. Municipalities or agencies will take advantage of the contractor, the Manson or whoever's doing the harbor dredging, being on site and basically contracting with them separately to do kind of basically a side job, if you will. So what we could do is take advantage of their mobilizations, and what the key benefit is that you save on the contractor's mobilization. So what the Corps or city could do was contract with the Corps dredger to do some more, to dredge the Camp Pendleton fillet or another high quality sand source and bring it down to city beaches to form that dry beach that we've been talking about. That's so important to the city for recreational benefits and also storm protection. So this would also be scaled at about the sand shifter or semi-fixed system volume at about 50 to 100,000 cubic yards per year. And the cost would be the lowest of the three, at about $9 million initially, and about the same as a sand shifter of about 200,000 per year to operate. Some other keys benefits to this, and also just the distribution pipeline system, is the safety benefits during construction. You don't have as much heavy equipment on the beach, laying the pipelines and making all that. So you kind of have a fixed system in place that you can just flip the switch, hopefully, and get sand down the beach. So in our evaluation of the sand distribution options, we like the semi-fixed system or the Corps piggyback options. However, we didn't get to the level of detail that we got to with the other action alternatives, because we really got to find that sustainable, high quality source of sand before we take the next step. So getting some assurances from Pendleton or finding something else as far as a high quality source of sand that can be accessed by the city on this kind of long-term basis is what we need before we can kind of take the next step on this. Okay, to summarize what we just talked about, the city of Oceanside has 4 major challenges. Harbor complex blocks this coarse grain size sand from making it to city beaches. This gradation of sand is really important for that recreational dry beach that the city and everybody's kind of after. It's good for storm protection, but also everything else as far as economics. The second one is the limited beach gains from the harbor dredging program. We're really not seeing the gains from that program. That's because of the gradation, it's because of the timing and means and methods of placement, et cetera. The regional beach sand projects, though not to discount them too much, it was definitely good for the city to participate in those, really didn't perform so well within the city beaches. We really think that's just because of just not having that retention in place. I mean, City of Carlsbad clearly benefited from those programs and still continue to have wide, stable beaches. And that key one is the difficulty reaching consensus and getting people to kind of work together and have a kind of a compromise or problem-solving mindsets together to kind of come to solutions has been something that the city's grappled with for a long time. We recommend the Groin pilot score the highest based on the MCA analysis. We recommend that project, the Groin pilot, be carried forward to the next phase. As far as sand distribution, we have a little bit more work to do in the evaluation of these options, but we need to figure out that high quality source of sustainable, high quality source of sand first. Thanks for your attention. I'm going to hand it off to Stacy to walk through some more Q&A.
Very good. And want to thank our presenters again for providing us some more information on how the feasibility study results have come in and were evaluated. We do want to acknowledge before we begin our Q&A session this evening that we're still going to publish your questions and comments so that other attendees may view them. And we just want to make sure that you know there are 2 ways that you can now participate. So Simona is going to open up the raised hand feature, and we'll talk to you a little bit about how you can use that in just a moment. And we'll continue using the Q&A feature. Lots of great questions coming in that I'll pitch up to the panel for a response. And we're going to alternate taking questions from both the Q&A feature as well as the raised hand feature tonight. If you do have to dive off early, we certainly understand. We would like to make sure that we answer everyone's question as we can this evening, but I see some of the questions have come in as duplicates, so I'll probably group those together. But after tonight's event, again, you will have an opportunity to present your questions or your comments. This is not the last opportunity for dialogue regarding this project, so Kyle Koger can be contacted. The email address and the phone number for Kyle, the Public Works Director at City of Oceanside, will remain on the screen throughout the Q&A event. So there are a few questions that I'll go ahead and prioritize for our panel, but want to go ahead and introduce our panel at this time. So if our panel could come back on camera, I think we have almost everybody. Laura, if you don't mind to come back on camera and just be prepared to unmute yourself to respond. And just a reminder of who we have answering questions tonight from the City of Oceanside. We have Kyle Koger, the Public Works Director. Russ Cunningham is here, the Principal Planner for the City of Oceanside. From GHD on the consulting side, Brian Leslie, the Project Manager, and Aaron Holloway, a Senior Coastal Engineer. And from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, Laura Ingeman, a the Coastal Resilience Specialist that you heard from earlier this evening. So we'll go ahead and begin the Q&A session. You are invited to participate again this evening. You can use the Q&A feature or the raised hand feature. So if you'd like to type your questions and comments to us, you'll want to use that Q&A feature. But if you would rather speak in your own voice to us and share your comment or your question, you'll want to use that raise hand feature to join a speaker queue. So during this period, we're going to again move back and forth between some slides that will instruct you on how to use the Zoom webinar platform features to ask these questions, and we'll alternate responding to groups of questions from both the Q&A and raised hand feature. We'd like to hear from as many of you as possible this evening. So I'm going to ask Simona if she's available. Can you give us some instructions on how you'd like us to use both of those features?
Yes, of course, Stacy, thank you. We've included instructions on the screen for how to participate using the Zoom webinar platform. This is just a friendly reminder. I see we've had some great questions and comments already, and I see the raise hand feature being used. But please take a moment to find the Q&A feature by looking for the conversation bubbles at the top or bottom of your screen. You can type in your question and select send. We will also be using the raise hand feature, which I have toggled on. So everyone, please, you can find that by looking for the hand icon at the top or bottom of your screen. You may want to check your audio settings. Look for the audio setting at the top or bottom of your screen and select device settings. If called upon, you will have 2 minutes to state your name, organization, and ask your question. After speaking, we do ask that you select lower hand. And Stacy, back to you.
Okay, a couple of questions that I wanted to prioritize this evening, and then I'll kind of dive back in order that had come through during the presentation, specifically because they are questions along the groin option that has been identified as a result of this study. Kathleen asks, will pilot groins degrade South Oceanside Beach more and stop more sand from flowing south? Brian, do you want to take that one for us?
Sure. So the pilot groin study within the pilot reach would be basically, we'd be looking within the next phase, which is final design, and to kind of mitigate those impacts through porosity and kind of different things with the structure, but also where the sand can be placed as far as like down drift of the structures. So you kind of have sand placed within the compartments, the growing compartments, but then you also, we know we need to put a certain amount down drift of the structures, and that's going to keep making its way down to the South Oceanside. So that's the things we'd be looking at within the next phase, and things that would be kind of optimizing to mitigate those impacts.
Very good. And another question regarding the groins. Do the cost estimates of groins include mitigation for sand that will no longer reach the southern areas? And Laura, thank you for contributing that question. Brian, do you want to take the question regarding cost estimates?
No, so it's a similar question to last, but no, there was no mitigation impacts within that. Though there was environmental kind of like the environmental and permitting process was captured within those cost estimates.
Very good.
The idea would be to have no impacts downdrift if we could. So that's what we'd be striving for, but we recognize that there would need to be some robust monitoring and also some kind of adaptability once we get out there. If we were to construct the project, we know we need to kind of manage the system to mitigate those downdrift impacts. Aaron, you want to hit on, I see a lot of South Oceanside comments and concerns about downdrift impacts there and why that wasn't considered within the study. You have any other thoughts about our impacts down there?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that, groins, they're designed to retain sand. And so if they're retaining sand, then there's a portion of that littoral drift that's not making it down coast. And so that's a widely acknowledged feature or impact of these structures. And so I think this project is going to be developed in a way that those impacts are mitigated. And there's plenty of examples of this up and down the coast where groin fields are put in place, they're pre-filled, and they're managed to mitigate those downdrift impacts. And so in a case like Oceanside, like under existing conditions, there's very little transport down coast right now. There's a significant sediment supply deficit. And so by adding sand into the system, a portion of which is going to pre-fill the groins, and then another portion which is going to go down coast of the groins, there's going to be more sand in the system than would otherwise exist. And so I think there would be monitoring measures to maintain those downdrift supplies. And that's also a key feature of why these sand distribution options need to be included, because part of any of these solutions, you need to have that sustainable source of coarse sand. And without that, not only will the project won't work, but also the downdrift impacts are going to continue with no sand supplied to South Oceanside. So there's two key elements, and one of that, of course, is this long-term supply of coarse sand, which is most logically found up coast of the harbor.
Thank you, Aaron. I think that also answers Ashwin's question about implications of downdrift. And Brian, appreciate you taking that and delegating to your project team member. Another question has come from Renee and Richard. What are the groins and reefs made of? Sand, rock, concrete? What can you share?
Yeah, so we're proposing they be made of rock. We looked at alternate materials, but rock is kind of the most trustworthy within this environment. Pratt's Reef was an example of geotextile bags kind of gone wrong. So we kind of like the idea of piloting something with a geotextile solution, though there's just challenges we couldn't overcome with that.
Thank you. And Margot asks, are groins what Newport Beach has?
They are. South Newport.
Dirk has asked, did you establish a cost benefit analysis for all the options you presented today?
We haven't gone as far as to do a federal cost benefit analysis or even like a NOAA statewide thing, but Aaron hit on the 30% of, I believe it was the environmental or the financial category, was the indirect benefits of a beach. So that's where the kind of the benefits are plugged in, and also kind of baked into some of the different MCA criteria. I know, Aaron, you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, at this stage in the project, we elected to go with the multi-criteria analysis just to capture kind of a wider range of criteria and features or potential impacts of the project. I think as things move forward and funding sources are sought, then we'd be forced to go through these more formal benefit cost analyses, which they're required for FEMA funding and for core funding, but oftentimes they're heavily weighted towards economics or things that can be quantified, and there's a very rigid formula to be applied in those estimates. So at this stage, we didn't find that to be the most beneficial tool, but it will be required in future for funding.
Very good. Mary has asked, has removing the outermost portion of the harbor breakwater been considered?
I think I don't know, Russ, can you speak to that? Is it, I think was it the core study or the VA kind of touched on that briefly? Maybe not.
Thank you, Brian. I have had no correspondence or no communication with the Corps or any other federal agency that would suggest that that's a viable prospect.
It was considered at one time, but I don't think it was seriously considered. So.
Very good. I'll take a couple more questions from the Q&A, and then we'll move over to the raised hand feature. I see at least 6 of you that like to speak, and we'll do our best to get to each of you. Joe asks, how does Carlsbad keep their sand? Have we thought about modeling after Carlsbad?
Yeah, Carlsbad's a key analog to what like I think Oceanside could be with sand retention structures, and that we hinted on that to that in the presentation. But so basically those jetties for Agua Hedionda Lagoon act like groins and have done a great job at retaining the regional beach sand project fill, that coarse sand that was placed by Sandag. So the way we could emulate that is to have sand retention structures in place in Oceanside to catch that sand as it's moving down drift.
Very good. Brian, very early on in your presentation, when you presented some graphs, you mentioned the word accretion, and I'm glad that Lynn asked this question. What is accretion?
Oh, accretion is sand accumulation. Yeah, inverse of erosion. So sorry.
Perfect. Thanks for baselining that for us. Ashwin also wants to know how many years of a pilot before we would address the rest of the Oceanside beaches, and that may be a longer term question that the city wants to tackle.
Yeah, I think what we're proposing tonight is they're looking at like a 20-year pilot. I don't know if we need 20 years to determine if something's going to work or not, but it will take some time to study, what the effects of these would have. I don't know if Brian or Aaron want to weigh in a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the costs we presented are 20-year life cycle costs, but I don't think we necessarily think that the pilot only has to be 20 years before we can build on it. I think we could start to build on success faster, maybe a 5-10 year time period, but we need to have enough time to make sure the science is in and kind of understand what it may or may not be doing to the system. I don't know, Aaron, do you have any more thoughts on that?
No, I would agree. I think the life cycle mentioned here of 15 to 20 years is strictly just to come up with kind of the cost side of things, not necessarily as the critical path to what needs to be done before you move down coast. So yeah, I agree with what you said, Brian.
Okay, the last question before we move over to raise hand, and then we'll come back and forth, of course, and alternate. Michael had a question regarding fixed trestle. He asked, doesn't the fixed trestle option deposit sand on the northern beaches, which may already have adequate sand, and doesn't it do very little for beaches below the strand that are suffering the most erosion? What can you share with us about the fixed trestle?
Yeah, the way we show the sand distribution pipelines currently is that they stop, the southernmost discharge location would be at Wisconsin. There's really, I don't know, Aaron, if you have thoughts here, but I think there's no real reason that pipeline couldn't go further south, except for there's some private property stuff to think through. But yeah, that pipeline could go further south and get sand. All those 3 systems have these pipelines. So the only thing with going further distances is you need more kind of boosters and kind of got to think through that whole thing. So you can't just have infinite distance of pipeline and expect sand to move through it. You got to kind of keep it charged with boosters. Any other thoughts on that, Aaron?
No, I think the goal is to get sand, have the ability to get sand on the other side of the retention system, and or as far down there as you can, and just let the ocean do the work for you. And ideally you'd bypass sand when you're coming into the winter season. So you kind of have that sand pushing down coast rather than, placing that sand at the start of summer where all that south swell pushes it back up toward the harbor. So there's a timing piece too that I think could work to the benefit of down coast communities.
Great, thanks to the panel. And now we're going to go ahead and open up our audio lines for those of you who have your hands raised. So I will call on you, and when I call on you, you may have a few buttons to push depending on how you've joined us this evening. So we'll take a pause until we can hear you. And then of course you'll have 2 minutes to state your name, your organization, and the question. So please be mindful of the timer, and then we'll leave your line open in case you have a very brief follow-up question, and then we'll continue to move on to the next person in the speaker queue. So I'll be calling on Brad, Thomas, and Joe in that order, and then after I take comments or questions from those 3, we'll make sure that we move on to the last of our poll questions this evening. I see a few of you leaving our presentation this evening. We understand that your time is very valuable, and we're grateful that you've spent it with us tonight. So Brad, when you're ready, you can unmute your line. Again, that's Brad. I'm not sure that we hear you. You may have to unmute your line. Okay, Brad, I'll come back to you. Thomas, you are the next person in our line, so we're going to ask you to unmute when it's convenient for you.
I think I have. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Terrific. First of all, thanks to all of you for holding the meeting and all the hard work you've obviously put in on our behalf. And so thanks to everybody at the city and everybody consulting with you. So what it appeared from every projectional graph that was shown is that it looks like there's going to be a further depletion of beaches south of Wisconsin, wherever any of the other ways of saving sand were presented. And of course, that's of great interest of us who live on the beach and near it south of Wisconsin. Is that true? That's my first part of my question. And is there a way to spread out the same amount of groins, or do they lose their retention value? And if we were to decide on one of the options, how soon would that begin to happen? That's the end of my question.
Perfect. Thank you. And Brian, I know you're poised. There's a lot to unpack there in Thomas's questions, which are all good. Let us know what's true about south of Wisconsin.
Okay, so yes, there was a number of components there that I'm trying to unpack, but south of Wisconsin kind of spoke to some of the downdrift impacts. I don't know, Aaron, do you want to speak to those in more detail?
Yeah, I think the reference is probably to the modeling graphics, which show the downdrift erosion. And so as part of those model runs, we did not simulate the revetment, which is in place today. So the revetment would obviously withstand, certain, erosion. There would still be, could be downcoast impacts to that lower part of the beach profile. But that's, I think, what he was alluding to is as far as the downcoast impacts. And of course, as we talked about, those are, the key consideration when we're talking about a pilot system. And so that's going to be the focus moving forward of, is there ways to fine tune the growing field to mitigate those? Is there, and then regardless of what we analyze or model, there's always going to be, things we have to rely on the monitoring for. And we have to have management measures in place to offset those impacts and provide a source of sand to downdrift reaches. So
And I think the other part of Thomas's question had to do with spreading out the groins. Is there a benefit or an effect to doing that?
I want to hit that one first. Well, I'll start and Aaron can chime in, but there is some key length to spacing ratios that are used in coastal engineering. So there is some effectiveness to having the growing compartments kind of the way we show them. I don't know, Aaron, do you have any other thoughts with kind of this larger spacing scheme?
Yeah, the goal here was that, you know, being a pilot, we want to simulate what a growing field would look like, because, you know, it's our view that groins are going to be needed throughout this whole reach. And so it'd be nice to simulate the effects of these different growing compartments. That's why we've proposed, you know, 4 groins, because you have kind of the up coast groin, the down coast groin, then you have kind of these 2 compartments in between, or 3 compartments in between, to kind of help understand how that system would behave. If the groins are spread out along the city, then you have benefits, but they're more localized, and they're going to be, you know, at that specific location where, you know, where the sand accumulates up against that groin.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we don't want to be kind of hamstrung by some of these, like I alluded to a compromise that the sand bypassing, experimental sand bypassing project had to do, and all projects require compromises, but we want to make sure that the pilot is successful, and then we can build off success, as opposed to kind of trying to spread it out, make too many compromises, and then we don't have a successful project. So it's kind of the balance we're trying to walk.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you, Thomas, for your questions. I'm going to go ahead and try to come back to Brad. So Brad, when you are available, you can unmute your line. Brad? I think we're having difficulty hearing Brad again. So I'm going to move on to the next hand up in line. Joe, when you're ready, we'll give you the availability to speak.
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me, Stacy?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, hi, it's Joe Davis, and I'm a resident of South Oceanside. My question is, I again, appreciate all the work you've all done to do all these models and everything, but I've not heard him mention about the Coastal Commission. And as a resident, we know we can't even repair our stairs here on the beach without approval from them. And so I'm wondering how the Coastal Commission, if they've been involved, just the idea of building a series of groins, whether they would even consider approving that or not. Thank you. That's my whole question.
Thanks, Joe. We appreciate that. Brian, what can you tell us about Coastal Commission involvement?
Yes, we did reach out to them a couple of times at a preliminary stage and presented the study and try to get feedback. And, you know, I'll say that things are changing there. They're understanding the coastal challenges that these cities are facing in light of especially sea level rise, and trying to build resilience, and kind of thinking over things in different time scales, as far as like what's the 30-year solution versus what's the 100-year solution, and they're different things. So I think that the door has crept open for these types of solutions. Also in light of recent articles like the one that Griggs et al. Prepared about the utility of groins in certain situations, certain coastal settings, and Oceanside being cited as one of those. So I think there is, the door isn't slammed shut anymore from the Coastal Commission's perspective, in my opinion. I know, Russ, I saw you come off mute. Do you have some thoughts?
Thank you, Brian. Let me take the opportunity to first acknowledge the extent of erosion that has occurred south of Wisconsin and extending down to the city's southern boundary. The city staff is mindful of the extent of erosion. We very, very much appreciate those property owners who have chosen to follow the prescribed process for seeking approval of revetment, repair, and maintenance. And we look forward to continuing to work with you to navigate that process and help you make those necessary repairs. With respect to the prospect of Coastal Commission approval of the concept laid out this evening, my experience tells me that the Coastal Commission remains reluctant to approve or entertain these types of improvements. However, as Brian mentioned, the discourse is evolving. And what we're beginning to hear is a recognition, an acknowledgement that each stretch of coastline is unique. Each stretch of coastline faces unique challenges, experiences unique conditions, and that consequently unique solutions may be warranted. So I think that is something we want to emphasize in our dialogue with Coastal Commission, that we are uniquely impacted by the Camp Pendleton Boat Basin, and that those unique impacts may require special consideration. To the extent that we commit to monitoring the impacts of this system or this approach, and diligently mitigating those impacts, I think that will help to gain Coastal Commission support. And then finally, I would say that our chances of success going it alone are much lower than if we are able to gather support from other entities within the region, be that SANDAG, the Climate Collaborative, other coastal jurisdictions located within the Oceanside littoral cell. So I think for city staff, one of our next steps is to begin some outreach and some dialogue with these other entities that have a stake in coastal adaptation, and see if we can't begin to speak with one voice at the regional level in our discussions with the Coastal Commission.
Thank you, Russ. I know that addresses some of the questions that had come in very early on regarding properties south of Wisconsin, or the beach area around the properties south of Wisconsin, as well as the Coastal Commission's involvement. So thank you for jumping in. And we're going to take one more raised hand participant before we move on to the polling. I do see that our attendees are starting to find we've probably crept into their dinner time. So Bruce Parker, we're going to allow you to come off of mute and you can share your question or comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Bruce. You want to let us know your name or organization or address in your question?
Okay, I'm known as the Oceanside Trench Coat guy, so I've been walking the Strand for several years and have noticed the deterioration of the sand. When I first started going there, you could walk down the ramp at Tower 7 onto the sand, which you cannot do today, that's for darn sure. You can't even go swimming there. So I'm very, very concerned that if we wait too long on this, we might even lose the Strand itself, because the street, the concrete street, is developing cracks. Oh, hold on, there we go. So, and also all these rocks, these pebbles that are showing up, also have me concerned because of the safety of hitting people and damaging cars and all that. Yeah, I'm just somewhat worried about our future if we don't get something started soon. So that's the end of my comments.
Thank you, Bruce. We appreciate you contributing to our event tonight and appreciate your comments. I'm going to take one more caller. I know I keep saying this, but I keep seeing hands go up. So one more caller before we start, or one more audio line before we start polling. Laird, would you like to come off of mute and ask your question or provide your comment? You'll have 2 minutes to do so.
Good afternoon. My name is Laird Stabler, and I don't feel that the questions regarding why this pilot program is not focused a little further south into South O have adequately been responded to. If we're putting groins up, we should start in the most devastated areas and work our way north. The groins themselves will start to capture sand and help it feed back in from Wisconsin north. But where it is direly needed now is the south side of Oceanside from Buccaneer back up to Wisconsin. Now, there's been a lot of, well, there's mitigation and there's this and there's that, but I haven't heard a concrete answer as to why we're not focused on the most devastated areas, working our way north. Can you please respond to that?
Very good. Brian, can you let us know the geographic boundaries again of the project as you respond to Laird's question, and maybe we'll invite others to weigh in on that. Laird, thank you for
Well, not a
comment.
question of the geographic boundaries. Those have been plainly made. I
Sure.
understand the boundaries. We're talking about as sand flows move north and south. If we were to place this study further south, it would still be a successful study. We would get the same data that we were looking at as long as it's placed to the north, but it would create a great deal of impact to the South Oak community and the folks that use those beaches, positive impact, while there would be residual positive impact between Wisconsin, if that was the furthest northernmost groin, going back up to the pier. We see that with the sand replenishment. As it comes in, it moves down through that area and it comes back up and goes away. So if we put another gate at the south end of Oceanside, that would create a larger stopgap. We could still monitor how much sand is coming into those groin areas, how much beach replenishment we're getting off of it. We would also then be able to measure another data set, which is how much north sand from that groin are we getting between that groin, the pier, and the southernmost jetty of the harbor. So I believe that by moving this study further south, we are actually gaining more information than by keeping it in the northern part of Oceanside. If you could address that, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Laird. So again, Brian, Laird's question is, why are we not focused further south? And it may help our other attendees as a reminder of what those boundaries of the study area were.
Yeah, no, that was clear. And so the answer is this pilot groin could fully be picked up and moved wherever to the south. We're just kind of based on the criteria that we described in our presentation of city ownership of the right of way, popularity of the beach, and the one other one that I can't remember at the moment. It was the reason why we picked that stretch of coastline, but there's really no reason why it couldn't be moved to South O if that's the desire from the community and other stakeholders. So, yeah, that's the pilot reach is very preliminary. It's what we are presenting at this time. We kind of knew there'd be some discussion around it, frankly. So this is good input. It's not final. So I don't know, Aaron, you have any other thoughts or Kyle?
Yeah, I probably should have said this earlier that, it is a pilot, and then we did pick an area that we thought would make sense, but it is important to know that there's going to be a lot more public outreach on this before we, get to where we want to be. Through the design and permitting phase, I mean, we if we can get to that point, we know there's going to be a lot more public outreach. And I think if the overwhelming majority want it in a certain location, then that's where we're gonna look to put it. So I know everybody's kind of focused on the area that we chose, but like Brian said, it can be moved, and we know that we need to get a lot more public input before we do anything.
Brian and or Aaron, can you speak to some of the logistical and financial challenges that might be associated with extending the sand nourishment southward of Wisconsin? Brian, you mentioned earlier that there would be a need for additional boosters to maintain sand flow through a longer stretch of pipe. Are there other considerations we should be mindful of?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other one that I brought up was just like the ownership issue, and trying to, basically you're coordinating with each property owner to say, can I put this pipe here? Kind of conversation. That's a thought that comes to mind. Aaron, you have any other thoughts? I think from an engineering side, there's solutions, but I think there's some nuance and detail to kind of work through with like where the pipeline would sit and how it navigates around these different ownerships.
Yeah, I think there would be difficulty managing the system, managing those downdrift impacts if located further south, because without having some fixed distribution system, you'd have to place the sand and then pick it up and move it further south, with trucks or some other system. So there would be some difficulties work out there, certainly.
Great, thank you to all of our panel members that responded. We'll go ahead and move on to our poll questions. And so Simona will show us the next slide here with question number 4. It will pop up on your screen in just a moment, but I'll read it out loud for you so you can consider whether or not you are supportive of groins as the preferred sand retention option. So let us know what you are supportive of. If you're supportive of groins, you can select A for yes, B for you support a different beach nourishment or sand retention option, C, you're not supportive of any options presented at this time, or D, you'd like to learn more before selecting an option above. So the poll question will appear on your screen and we'll give everyone to respond. And I'm seeing several of our attendees have disconnected from this evening. So there are about 132 of you still on the line with us, and about 78% of those 132 have voted. So we're hearing from just over 100 of you, and it looks like 78 out of 107 are supportive, or 73% of groins is the preferred sand retention option. We'll close that poll. Or Simona, maybe she's sharing those results. I appreciate that. We're going to pause to capture your thoughts on that. 73% of you are supportive of groins as a preferred sand retention option. And then our next question, if you're not supportive of groins as the preferred option, we do still want to hear from you. Which option would you support? Based on the options that you heard about this evening, would you select A, beach nourishment, B, South Jetty, the San Luis Rey groin extension, C, multi-purpose artificial reefs, or D, maybe you still want to learn more before selecting any of the options above, or E, you're not supportive of any options presented at this time. So we'll launch that poll question on your screen and give you a few moments to respond. And still have a few results coming in. This one is a little bit more close with a few less respondents, of course, because maybe you were supportive of groins. But for those of you who are supportive of a preferred option, we'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results. It does appear that we've had a bit of a tie for the multi-purpose artificial reefs, and wanting to learn more about the options before selecting one. So appreciate your input on that. I think we are complete with questions for polling. Simona, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
I appreciate that. Thanks for giving me that cue. So I do want to dive back into some of the early questions that came into the Q&A feature. And just a reminder, if you do have to pop off early tonight, we are going to let you know that, again, after tonight's event, there will be other opportunities for you to participate and continue these discussions or ask your questions. You can direct those to Kyle Koger, the Public Works Director. His email address is hkkoger@oceansideca.org, or you can call 760-435-5089. That information will remain on your screen. So again, some of this is repetitive. I just want to make sure that we've caught, especially for anyone that's joined late. We mentioned the locations of the pilot program, but kind of one more time, specifically regarding Buccaneer Beach. Why are we not doing the pilot at Buccaneer Beach, where most activity and use is concentrated due to surfing, beach, and park recreational areas, and extra off-street parking is located? And that question came to us from Thomas.
Yeah, similar response to the previous comment. So we could pick up the pilot and move it to South O if that is a desire from the community and everybody's on board. But I think it's important, I'll just note that in order to get to the build out scenario, if like the whole, the build out scenario, which is multiple groins, the whole stretch of the shoreline having groins, we need to kind of all agree on where the pilot goes and make sure the pilot's successful, so we can all kind of leverage that to and kind of move towards that build out. So just kind of yeah, I'll just say like community kind of cooperation there, and just kind of understanding that it might not be in front of your favorite beach at first, but it could be if we can just get something in the water and start to build towards something.
Thanks, Brian. Ken has a question regarding the scenario modeling. Why is investment in scenario modeling when the agreement between the model predictions and past changes in shoreline due to previous actions is not good? So why is why has there been investment in scenario modeling when the agreement between the model predictions and past changes in shoreline due to previous actions is not good? And you may want to reading it as it came in there.
Sure, I'll start and hand off to Aaron, but we needed something to compare the options against each other. And like within our reach, we had reasonable agreement. It wasn't, as Aaron spoke to, it wasn't perfect, but it was apples to apples in the way it compared alternatives to one another. I know, Aaron, if you want to chime in there.
Yeah, it's not uncommon in coastal modeling to not have perfect agreement with measured results. I mean, what you're looking for is just trends that are consistent with observations, and that you can, that would make sense. If does the beach behave as you expect with a series of groins or reefs? And in that case, the model did. So it is of use. It's not the, final say in what we think is going to happen, of course. And, the most sophisticated modeling you could do is physical modeling. And the Corps of Engineers did that in 1980. They tested all sorts of different configurations. I think there was 80 different configurations, and they ended up with a growing, series that looked just like the one we modeled at full scale. And so even with the best modeling you could do, that's what was determined to be the most effective solution. So yeah, I think
Yeah, I was gonna say that the Corps had problem with agreement with their physical model, even at that time, because of some like the complications with the complicated wave climate and some of the things going on that are specific to Oceanside that Aaron mentioned. So even with the kind of the Cadillac of models, which is this build out of basically a big pool, scaled down version of Oceanside with harbor and all these different scenarios of shoreline protection, they still had difficulty replicating what happens in Oceanside.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to take a few more questions out of the Q&A feature and just remind our panel to keep your responses brief so that we can try to get to all of the questions that are coming in tonight. Certainly appreciate all the comments and participation. A question from Laura while we're on cost estimates. Do the cost estimates of groins include mitigation for sand that will no longer reach southern areas?
Sorry, I missed the first part of that question. It sounded familiar.
Sure.
Is that
that's fine. I'll repeat it. From Laura, do the cost estimates of groins include mitigation for sand that will no longer reach the southern area?
Right. Thank you. Yeah, we answered this one. There's no. So the project does include amount of prefill, and some of that prefill nourishment is going down drift. What percentage was that, Aaron? Was it like 50,000 of the 300,000 was being placed on the south end of the structures?
I think it was more than that. I think it wasn't quite 100,000, but it was a significant amount was placed down coast initially. But then we have in the budget 2 renourishment events of, different volumes depending on the alternative. I think we assumed, management actions involve another 150,000 cubic yards every 5 years for groins. Now, where that would be placed would depend on the monitoring, of course. So if all the impacts are down coast, then that 150,000 cubic yards would be placed down coast to mitigate that. And those volumes are just kind of our initial estimate. Those would be refined further, but that's an example of how the pilot, would be designed to mitigate those type of impacts.
Perfect. And some questions have come in on timelines of this potential groin pilot, both from KZ asking what would the construction timeline look like for pilot groins, and Charlotte, what are some ideas about timelines to begin the pilot, as well as how long the project will likely last, and any idea in time on when visible results could be observed.
I'll take that, Stacy. We're now at the end of this feasibility study, and we're going to be taking it to the City Council on August 11th at 2 p.m. And hopefully they'll accept, what we've shown today and give us direction going forward. And we'll be recommending that we move this project to the design and permitting phase. I'm not sure how long that would take. I think it would at least be a year. Like I said, we'd have to do a lot of public outreach. I'll let Brian or Aaron weigh in on the time frame for that. Once we get through that, and assuming it's bought off by all the regulatory agencies, then we can move to construction. All the options that were presented tonight are very expensive, so we're going to have to figure out how we're going to pay for this. And there's several different ways that might can happen. We do need to still find a good source of sand, as they mentioned earlier. So we're probably still a little ways off, but we got to get started somewhere. And we've spent the last year coming up with this feasibility study, and I think it's important if we move to the next phase.
Thanks, Kyle. Carolyn has the question about potential surfing impacts. All of the options, Brian, that you presented, it seems have surfing impacts that are unknown. Is that correct, or do you want to
Yeah,
provide
I would
some
say
context?
I'd say that's correct. And that each of the options, even nourishment and status quo or no project, have unknown surfing impacts. Or there's things we can say about each, though, as far as like qualitatively how we think they're going to impact surfing. No action, as we're already seeing some like the backwash off of the revetments within South O. So there's already negative impacts being realized from an eroded beach profile. Things like groins, there's lots of examples around the world where groins have improved surfing. We can't guarantee that. The multi-purpose reef, we'd be trying to optimize those edges to be surfable. And what's the last one, like San Luis Rey groin? So yeah, to answer your question, they all have potential impacts. We'd be trying to, just like downdrift impacts, try to mitigate those through different ways.
Thank you. And a couple of questions have come up regarding the Army Corps, Camp Pendleton. Is there a rep from MCI West and Camp Pendleton participating tonight? So Kyle, I don't know if the city wants to take a question regarding any involvement that you've had regarding this project with the Corps, Camp Pendleton, the Corps of Engineers, Camp Pendleton, or a representative from MCI West.
Yeah, so, as I mentioned earlier, Camp Pendleton Harbor was built in 1942. The federal government came out with their first report in 1953, I believe it was, and they took full responsibility for a major loss of sand on Oceanside beaches was contributed by building that harbor. The Corps still says that, they acknowledge it's their responsibility to eventually fix the problem, but it's been going on for a very long time. We've done numerous studies We have a study going on right now that hadn't been funded in a few years that we're trying to get the Corps back on. So yeah, we've talked to the Corps many times about this problem and how they need to make us whole. We have talked to some folks at Camp Pendleton about possibly using sand on their side of the breakwater for this project, and we haven't gotten very far. They they have real concerns about letting us use any of that sand, but in my opinion, it's not really their sand. They built a structure in 1942 that holds a lot of that sand there that would otherwise have been moving downstream. So there's a lot more discussion that needs to be had.
Very good. Has there been consideration of taking out the harbor jetties and opening up a natural sand flow?
That idea has been raised before, but I don't think it was ever really taken seriously. I don't know that. I mean, it would affect the harbor if we did that, probably. So, there's been talk of removing the large breakwater, maybe doing a redesign to allow sand to come through, a reconfiguration of the breakwater, but I don't think it's ever been really seriously considered.
A question's come in from Michael. Would it be accurate to conclude that we need both a series of groins from the pier to the Buena Vista Lagoon and Carlsbad border and the fixed trestle to provide a source of sand? Brian, has the team considered kind of dual solutions or dual options?
Yeah, so we acknowledge that we need kind of both. And within any of these options, we need sand, lots of it in a good quality sand source. So whether it's any of the 3 distribution options we presented, or even something we haven't thought about yet, but just a way to get to access this sand source moving forward is going to be really important.
Very good. I want to go back to our folks who have their hands raised. It's going to be important to hear their questions or comments in their own voice tonight. So I'm going to call in the next 3 in this order. I'm going to call on Bob first, and then Sherry, and then Colleen. So Bob, when you're ready, you'll have 2 minutes to state your name, your organization, or let us know where you live, and your question or comment. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, great. Bob Ashton, longtime Oceanside resident, live in South O. I'm a board member of SOS Oceanside, and I'm one of the citizen science contributors. So the question I have is, how does the groin design take into account emergency vehicle access, such as lifeguards or other EMS personnel? I mean, right now, the EMS personnel can't even get to the beach half the time due to the tides and no beach. And also, those of us who like to run the beach or walk the beach, how will the groin design allow us to come up and over the groin, or how does that work? Thank you.
Thanks, Bob, for those 2 questions. So Brian, what can you tell us? Will the design impact emergency response at the beach or in the ocean?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Bob, and your contributions to the citizen science program. We appreciate it. Yeah, so that would be a key design consideration for the next phase and refinement, but we already have some ideas. You look at the Newport groin example, a lot of those crests, the crest of the groin are low enough that they're buried much of the time. Kind of acknowledge or see that the groin actually goes all the way back to the seawall or revetment against the property. So that would be one solution, is to have it buried with sand. Another thought is to something like Oceanside Boulevard. We have kind of the ramp down to the south right now. You can kind of have a ramp in both directions where emergency vehicles can get on either side. But personally, I like the example of Newport, where you can kind of don't see the structure most of the time. It's kind of buried. Aaron, any other thoughts? Okay, thanks, Bob.
Okay, and Sherry, we have you next. When you'd like to come off mute, please do. Sherry, if you're trying to speak to us, we can't hear you. I'll give you a couple more seconds.
There we are.
There you are.
Yeah, I said thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. My question is, did the study investigate the impacts of existing riprap and their contribution to beach erosion? And if not, why?
That was not in the scope of our study. And our study was focused on how to build and retain sand, sandy beach. So I don't know, Kyle or Russ, can you speak to maybe the passive erosion issues that are to do with the revetment?
Yeah, I mean, I just think we focused the study on how can we get, wider beach widths, and that was the main focus of the study. That's how I'd answer that.
And I would just add that the erosion issue is certainly the revetment is a factor, but so too is over 100 years of beachfront development, both private and public. So in addition to residential development, of course, we have a public roadway on the beach. We have other public amenities. We have the harbor, et cetera. So all of these have hardened the back beach and the bluff, and all of these contribute to fixing the bluff in place and preventing that natural process of bluff erosion and beach retreat from occurring.
Thanks, Sherry, for the question about the riprap. Colleen, I'm going to call on you next. Colleen, if you'd like to come off mute, you can state your question or your comment.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. My comment is that once again, the city is focusing on from Wisconsin to the harbor. We have another half of a city sitting here with a beach that needs to be addressed that does not have any sand. So once again, we're taking South O and setting it aside. Kyle, I'm putting this on you. You need to make sure that South O is included in this sand retention program. We have Buccaneer Beach, we have Cassidy, we have Tyson. South, everything south of Wisconsin also needs sand, not just for our tourists. We have residents here that need the sand. So start listening to the residents. Thank you very much.
I'll comment, Stacy.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we need to dial back a little bit, realize that this is just a pilot project, that it's a feasibility study to see what we think will work in the city. So we've developed these concepts in some areas we think it'll work. We need to do a pilot to make sure it'll work. And then this is just the first part of a much larger project that will go on for years. So it's not showing favoritism to one part of the city or another. It's, hey, what's going to work? And let's prove that it'll work. And then we can expand it from there. I go back to what I said before. If South O is determined through public outreach that needs to be the place that we start, then I think that's probably where we're going to start. We're not trying to play favorites. We're just trying to figure out what's feasible for the city, what's going to work, and let's try and do something that's going to be successful, and then we can grow it from there.
Thank you, Colleen. And I know Colleen shares some of the same sentiments that we saw in the Q&A feature from Kimberly, and of course, several other questions and comments that have come in regarding location, especially south of the area. So we certainly appreciate hearing from those residents this evening. I'm going to go ahead and go to Nick and then Rick in that order. So Nick, when you're ready, you can come off mute and state your question or your comment. Nick, are you with us?
Yep.
Thank
Sorry
you.
about that.
Don't
But
be
I've been
sorry.
lost in the mix. My name is Nick Ritchie. I'm a South O resident. I'm a board member of Save Oceanside Sand. And I want to thank the city once again for their diligence and focus on this critical issue for our city. And my question, I guess I'll ask it again. It's going to be somewhat redundant, but I'll just say it again, just simply because I want to make sure it does come to fruition. Living in South O, once again, when I saw the field of groins that was proposed, and I know it's just a proposal, we're just working at kind of an early stage. It's imperative that these groins be placed from Tyson to Wisconsin to Oceanside Boulevard and to Buccaneer, because these are the areas that are most devastated and are at most risk for not being able to recover. So that's basically all I'm saying is I'm going to ask you guys, please make it a priority for South O. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for sharing your comment and participating with us tonight as well. The next person with their hand raised is Rick. Rick, would you like to come off mute and share your question or state your comment? Rick, we can't hear from you, but I know you may. There you are.
Hi, Rick Stern. We have owned beachfront property at 1600 block of Pacific Street, snugged up to Buccaneer Beach since 1972. As a 15-year-old kid, I used to burn my feet running from the hot sand to the water. There were volleyball nets set up. There was an abundance of sand. And the Del Mar Boat Basin was built 30 years prior to that. But I just don't understand. But my current question is, I'm all for groins. I'm all for any kind of sand retention, but where is Sandag or Army Corps or anybody for the replenishment that we had, the last one we had in 2012? I realize these things are important that we're talking about, and I'm all for all kinds of retention, but where's our knight in shining armor pumping sand onto our beaches? Because I mean, we have none. We have, as everyone has stated, everyone knows, there's no sand. Is there any plan to bring the pumper in from the Great Lakes and do what they've done? They did it, 2004 and 2012, I guess it's been over 10 years, right?
Yeah, I'll answer that. The last regional beach sand project was done in 2012. And I know Sandag is looking into doing a third regional beach project. They haven't been able to find the funding. They have to do surveys offshore to determine where sand is available that can be placed on the beaches. Obviously, it's a lot of funding that's needed to do a project of that size. I know they're working on it, but they just haven't gotten there yet. As far as the Corps, the main reason that we probably went down the path of doing this feasibility study is because we've been waiting on the Corps for years to do something, and they just keep dragging their feet. So the city council, a little bit over a year ago, said we need to take this on ourselves. So that's why the city took it on to do a feasibility study to see, hey, how can we get more beach width? So we keep pressing the Corps through our senators, our congressmen. We're going to DC every year asking that for project funding, but it is what it is. I think the city has shown that we're trying to do something ourselves now, and hopefully down the road we can get the federal government or regionally some help to get where we want to be.
I appreciate all your work.
Thank you.
Rick, thanks for sharing your comments this evening. I do want to take a question that came in a little bit earlier from the Q&A feature while we get the next folks who have their hands raised set up to speak to us. A question came in through Denny. Has GHD considered interlocking precast concrete piles as a quick and less expensive option to build the groins under the pilot project? Brian may have stepped away. Nope, there he is. Do you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, quick bite. Interlocking piles. Aaron, you want to speak to that? Did we talk about like a sheet pile system?
Yeah, that sounds like a sheet pile type system, which, we did not consider, but it may be worth considering, as we get further through design, as far as looking at materials and systems that are kind of adaptable and reversible. But I'm not aware of any instances of those structures working well in an open coast wave climate. And, with the currents you'd expect in this type of environment, you get a lot of rip currents forming alongside the structures. And so with the changing depths on one side and the other, it would present some challenging loading scenarios, I imagine, to work through from a structural standpoint. So that could be one reason why you don't see many of those around. But yeah, I think looking at alternative materials is definitely be part of a future phase of this.
A question came from Phil, and we know you've addressed the questions that have come in regarding the Coastal Commission approval or involvement. Will the city and the Coastal Commission include a process for residents to rebuild collapsed revetments as part of this process? Was that considered for this pilot?
Hand that to Kyle or Russ. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't considered as part of this study. But Russ, do you want to kind of comment?
Sure, Kyle. Yeah, so we are working with the Coastal Commission, continuing our dialogue with the Coastal Commission, seeking to work through some of the ambiguity in the permit process and some of the divergent interpretations that the city and the Coastal Commission have over what constitutes repair and maintenance that can be exempted from a permit, that can be approved at the city level, and that requires state approval through the Coastal Commission process. That conversation is ongoing and will likely be ongoing for quite some time. In the interim, we do encourage property owners to contact us in planning, invite us to your properties to look at existing conditions and work through what options are available to repair and maintain the revetment. As I mentioned earlier, we very much appreciate those property owners, both individually and in some cases collectively, coming to the city to initiate a process consistent with our local coastal program. We have sent out letters on 2 occasions now over the course of the last 2 years, encouraging property owners not to take matters into their own hands, but to work with us at the city. We will, by and large, support your efforts to repair your revetments should you require a coastal development permit from the Coastal Commission.
Russ, thanks for responding and letting us know that there is a path forward for individual residents that may be on the line, wondering how they can reach out. I do see a question regarding the areas outside of Oceanside and some of their experiences and how they're doing with comparisons. So Brian, what can you tell us about other community beaches south of Oceanside to San Diego? Do we know how they're faring, how they've implemented similar solutions? What can we learn from those comparisons? And are those communities doing anything that we could learn from or partner with in a design process?
Yeah. Well, I think I'll start to Russ's point. As acting as a region, the city acting as a region to do these types of implement these types of strategies. I think that's really important to doing for any successful project within a coastal city in San Diego. As far as examples down coast, there's no sand retention other sand retention structures happening at the moment. Most recent shoreline protection project that I can think of, I mean, the nourishment is still active in the region, usually mostly like small scale nourishment projects, opportunistic beach fill type of stuff. And Encinitas, the Cardiff Living Shoreline was an example that was done, which was like a hybrid green gray solution where there's a buried revetment and a living shoreline or a dune system on top of it. So that's an example. So there's different things going on within the region, but I'd say that Oceanside and what we're talking about here is bigger and different than what others are dealing with. The problems in Oceanside are bigger in scale and more kind of evident than other places in the city or in the region as well.
Very good. Thanks, Brian. I'm going to go back because I see some, at least 2 people have had their hands raised and been waiting patiently as we turn back to letting our attendees speak their comments or their questions with us in their own voice. And so I'm going to call on Lynn and then Elise. So Lynn, will open your line and you'll have 2 minutes to state your name, organization, and your question.
Hi, thank you. I'm really appreciative. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay,
go ahead.
Lynn Abate Johnson. I live in South Oceanside. Buccaneer was our beach that we walked to almost every day, and we'd walk down to Carlsbad and back. But now we've just bought a $100 parking permit, so we can drive to the harbor and do our walks and exercise and enjoy the beach there. So I just wanted to say that's my perspective, and I'm keenly aware because I'm part of I'm a volunteer with SOS. I'm keenly aware of all of the other issues that are impacting our community as a whole. And I was wondering, first of all, I'm very appreciative of all of this information, and I don't want to miss a thing, but I'm going to have to jet pretty soon. So I was wondering if you would consider gathering up all of these questions and creating a FAQ maybe on the website to address some of the things that maybe didn't that you didn't have time for tonight, or that we can have. People have been asking for a transcript of the presentation. The chat alone is worth its weight in gold because it's got so much great information. So I was just wondering if you guys would be willing to document this somehow for us all, especially all of the citizens who didn't get to come tonight.
Great, thanks, Lynn. I'll probably throw that one to the city. Kyle, do you want to let our attendees know what you'll be making available on the city's webpage?
Yeah, so this is our second workshop. The first workshop, I think we put up within a week afterwards, and this one as well is being recorded. So folks, we'll probably put it up on the website by next week, I'm guessing, and folks can go back and watch the whole thing, or get all the information off of it that they want.
Very good. Thank you, Kyle. Elise, you're next. Elise, you want to come off of mute and let us know who you are, who you represent, or where you live, and your question or your comment.
Yes, hi, my name is Elise Weatherall. I am a born and raised resident of Oceanside. I was fortunate to grow up on the beaches as a young little babe, and now I'm a mother of an almost 2-year-old that I love to take down to the beach. I'm also a graduate of UCSB with a degree in environmental science. So my question is focused more on the ecosystem. I've heard that about 50% of the ecosystem gets wiped out every time we pump sand on the beach. And I'm talking about crabs and grunion. And one of my favorite things to do with my son is take him down to the beach and dig for sand crabs now that I don't have the ability to go surfing all the time. So I was wondering what, if we were to put groins in, what that might be doing to our local predators and lovely critters and all the things that we love so much in the ecosystem.
Great, Elise, thanks for sharing your beach stories with us. And Brian, what can you tell us about other projects that have implemented groins? Have they looked at impact to the surrounding ecosystem or wildlife?
Yeah, as kind of Aaron alluded to, sorry, the groins, the sand retention strategies would involve less sand placement. So there's a kind of a key benefit to that strategy, and that we don't have to impact the beach as much through the direct placement of sand. There's still a sand piece, like we still need sand, but there's less. So yeah, I know there's a lot of research around this, the beach ecology, and I know these systems are, I don't know, I won't even speak to it. I was going to say they're pretty resilient in but they, I'm not even going to go there, but I know there's been a lot of work like on the beach benthos pre and post nourishment, both in on the East Coast and also in California now. And they kind of like have some recovery times past nourishment, and there's some kind of best practices that that have kind of been baked into beach nourishment projects that we'd be looking at. So I appreciate the comment.
Great, and thanks, Elise. I don't see any other hands raised. I'm going to go back into the Q&A feature for just a bit. I am seeing people start to dip off, so we still have 88 folks who are still with us here toward the end of our presentation. So I'm going to just try to capture a few of the questions from the Q&A feature that we haven't covered. Of course, lots of comments coming in about the areas south of Wisconsin and South Oceanside Beach. So as mentioned before, we're capturing all of those comments and questions, and appreciate hearing from all of the residents and all of those who have an impact from beach loss or from an potential implementation of a pilot program. One question has come in from Carolyn. Can you speak to the beach breaks? What happens to the beach breaks and the effects on the surf if groins are installed? And her comment is a groin will stop the north-south sand migration. So what happens to the beach breaks and the effects on the surf? Brian, you want to share what that looks like?
Sure. So I'll start with the last piece of that comment first. So the downdrift impact is something we've talked about. So yeah, they do interrupt the flow of sand, and that's kind of by design, so they can help catch sand. As far as beach breaks, like they will potentially change the surf, sometime in a positive way. Look at Newport, where some of those groins is kind of like a persistent rip that happens within these groin features, and that could kind of make like kind of new takeoff zones and different types of waves. So not as much of still a beach break, but it has kind of an early entry, if you will. So there's lots of examples of surfing around groins, like high quality waves around groins. This is a different experience than kind of a wide open beach break, but there would still be a significant stretch of Oceanside that would be beach break. I don't know, Aaron, any other thoughts on groins and their impact on surfing? No. Okay. Hope I captured it.
Okay, still not seeing any hands raised, so I'm going to stay in the Q&A feature to make sure that we capture and record some other questions that have come in. With the groins, are people able to walk to the beaches during low tides from Oceanside south as far as we can go before hitting the impassable outlet? So this may have been a tack on response here to Bob's question we heard earlier regarding active recreation. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so within the groin design, the refinement, next phase, we would be looking at ways to make the lateral access work, which is lateral is a fancy word for access along the beach for both people and also emergency vehicles. So there's different ways, like the Newport example, where those structures are buried most of the time, so people can just walk right over them. That's probably the simplest answer. But if there is exposed, there could be a contingency plan where there's a ramp or steps that go up and down. So if the structure is exposed, there's still a way around.
Thank you. I think a lot of the questions that I'm seeing are probably repetitive, certainly being captured, certainly getting all of the comments and the questions compiled here. Just searching to see if there's anything new. From Bob asking again, doesn't the sand retained and the resulting widened beach from a retention device significantly decrease or eliminate the degenerative energy from the fixed shoreline structures such as revetments and or seawall strand? Brian, let me know if you need me to read.
Yeah, no, I think that
restate
makes,
that.
I think I got that. I think it's saying that, just acknowledging that the retention of a beach helps the loading, reduces the loading on the revetments, the shoreline protection structures, which is correct. If you, yeah, a beach helps.
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm seeing any new questions, but if Kyle or Brian or Russ, if you've seen anything come in on the Q&A feature, I'll let you, I'll keep looking, but I do see a couple of attendees now with raised hands. So Bob and Malalani, I will make sure that you're called on next. And Bob, if I haven't captured that last question correctly, we'll go ahead and let you unmute again and share your question or comment.
Yeah, Stacy, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. I think the question I wanted to pose was, once we start retaining sand, we have a wider beach. Therefore, that negative, degenerative, reflected wave action doesn't continue to degrade your beach because it's not there anymore, right? Because you're hitting the beach versus the revetment. So now you don't have all this further scrubbing of the sand and movement of the sand. You have a beach that cushions that energy. Is that true, or is that a positive impact of retaining and having groins?
Yeah. Yep, that's right.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, Bob, for clarifying for us. Appreciate you jumping in. And now I'll go to Malalani. Do you want to come off mute and share your question or comment?
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me. I didn't realize I had my Hawaiian language teaching name there. This is Michael Odegaard. And I just want to say that the groins are also used in Huntington, and look how wide those beaches are. But I'm glad for all this discussion on groins, but are we going to include any kind of like harbor expansion in this master plan? I see that as maybe a financing mechanism with increased slip fees and stuff like that. As we expand the capacity of that component, could that become a part of the overall plan to incorporate, a permanent sand dredging operation coming out of Del Mar maybe, or the harbor area, and then, having underground pipes going all the way down to maybe even as far as Oceanside Boulevard, or at least Wisconsin Beach?
I'll speak to that. That was actually considered in a study that we read about years ago, where the Camp Pendleton built their harbor, then the city decided 20 years later to build the city harbor, and then it was looked at some plans to expand. And I'm not, excuse me, I'm not exactly sure why it never was. I think it was some logistic issues and what it would take to build it, but. We're actually going through a harbor condition assessment right now to look at all the infrastructure in the harbor. And, at some point we are going to have to look at possibly raising slip fees, or, looking at other measures to generate more revenue to fix a lot of infrastructure in the harbor. So it needs a lot of work on its own. Very good. So mahalo for your question there, Michael. And
thank you also to Kyle for responding. I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time, but I do want to point out Ken's question in the Q&A, and this is, of course, a question that we get a lot when we work on projects near the coastal areas. What would Groins do to mitigate sea level rise with climate change? And if you'll permit me some space here, I think maybe we should be asking Brian, do we take into consideration sea level rise and climate change when we look at these options?
Yeah, we definitely do. And the short answer is that they help to a certain extent. So to kind of remedy or kind of mitigate against modest rates of sea level rise, like 2 feet of sea level rise and less, having a beach is a significant benefit. It just gives you more buffer and gives you a bit more resilience. Aaron, you want to add on to that as far as sea level rise and how we considered it, the MCA or otherwise?
No, I don't think so. I think that's the key message, is that, you know, they just provide a beach, and the beach is a key feature of, you know, adapting and mitigating impacts from sea level rise.
Stacy, I'll follow up on that question. So as I pointed out earlier, it's not just shoreline protection, but it's 100+ years of development on our beaches and bluffs that have fixed in place our coastline, and that, you know, effectively prevent the natural process of bluff erosion and beach retreat from occurring. That would occur as sea level rises under a natural condition, which we do not have. That said, the latest science indicates that over the last 10 years, we've had about 3 inches of sea level rise on the West Coast. And projections indicate that we should see roughly that same amount of sea level rise going forward essentially through the 21st century, unless we experience some significant cataclysmic events in the polar regions that could quickly and significantly raise sea level. So to Brian's earlier point about the extent of sea level rise and there being a point at which retaining sand and preserving beach no longer is effective in holding back the water from the immediate shoreline and development on the shoreline, that is something that we need to be mindful of. And I think Brian indicated that you know, when we get to somewhere around 24 inches of sea level rise, it's unlikely that many of the structures, more vulnerable structures, lower lying structures on our beachfront can be preserved and protected in place.
Perfect. I think that brings us almost to the close. Kathleen has snuck in with one last question that we'll take, and then Kyle, I'll turn it over to you to close out your next steps and summary. Kathleen would like to know what is the city's position on managed retreats? Brian, you want to tell us a little bit about what managed retreat is, and Kyle, if you want to chime in after that with the city's perspective.
Sure. Yeah, managed retreat is the realignment or removal of properties from coastal properties to kind of get out of, to kind of Russ's points, kind of like moving this 100 years of development along the coastline slowly, or kind of manage in a managed way. So whether that's, yeah, in different ways, I'll leave it at that. And Kyle and Russ, if you want to pick up there.
Russ, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So we have we've drafted a coastal hazards adaptation plan as part of the comprehensive update of our local coastal program. And that draft plan identifies a wide range of coastal adaptation strategies, including strategies that we've discussed this evening. And what we emphasize in that adaptation plan is that the science is something that we need to be mindful of, but as the scientists themselves will tell you, there is a lot of uncertainty about what we're going to experience in the years ahead. And there are factors at play that will determine to a large extent how significant sea level rise will be in the foreseeable future and in the long term. So given that a typical planning horizon is 15 to 20 years, our adaptation plan is looking out to that time frame. And within that time frame, we don't see sea level rise presenting an existential threat to beachfront development. And we do think that within that planning time frame, within that horizon, there are things we can do to mitigate the impacts of sea level rise, of tidal events and of storm events that are eroding our beaches and having impacts on coastal development.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Russ, for jumping in there to take the last question of the evening. At this time, I'll thank the panel, those from the city, GHD, and from SIO for joining us tonight to not only present, but to stay on late in your evening to share responses to important questions from residents and concerned community members and those who enjoy the beach or have indications that they've been impacted by beach loss. So thank you very much. You can come off of mute if you'd like at this time. And we thank those of you, of course, who submitted your questions, raised your hand, and we do have comments recorded from all of you in the Q&A feature, as well as the recording of those of you who chose to share your questions and comments in your own voice tonight. The questions and the responses will become part of the project record and can be made available, but a reminder that all of the questions that have been received tonight will be available to the city after this event. So this concludes our Q&A session, and Kyle, I'll turn it over to you for the what's next.
Thank you, Stacy. So as I said earlier, we'll be bringing the report, the feasibility study report to council, the city council workshop on August 11th at 2 p.m. That'll be in the council chambers. I believe the meeting will also be on Zoom for those that want to watch in from home. We're still look to, for funding for the next phase, which is final design and permitting, and we're going to continue dialogue with stakeholders and resource agencies. Thanks. The closing message, I just wanted to say that the results shared tonight are really not new ideas. Groins have been considered a viable option for Oceanside in several previous reports and publications over the years. So I think a lot of the results of this study really aren't new to us. Here's some publications and studies that had been done previously that either said groins would be a viable option in Oceanside or actually recommended groins in Oceanside. Oceanside has been losing its shoreline for many, many years. For the past 20 years since being monitored, we have lost shoreline at a rate of 3 feet per year on average. We are below our baseline beach width from 20 years ago, even with the annual dredging project and the 2 regional beach sand projects. Sand nourishment alone just doesn't seem to be working. I want to thank everybody again for their participation today. We had a lot of folks watching in. I counted up to about 177. I thought there might have been a few more. If you have any questions or comments after the meeting, you can send them to me. Stacy will put it up on the screen there, or you can call me at my email address or my phone number, 760-435-5089. Again, thank you for your participation tonight.
Thank you all. And this concludes today's event. You may exit the event by clicking the red leave icon. Have a good evening. Thanks. Good night.